Hi everyone, I'm happy to be sharing with you a video overview of a trip I took in August 2018, which I called the Civil War Tour. The main idea of this trip was to connect some of the major sites related to the American Civil War, not too far away from my hometown of Washington, D.C., and make a roughly week-long driving tour out of it. I returned from this trip both in one piece and with a heightened sense of some of the major elements of the U.S. Civil War, including the causes for its outbreak, the course of the conflict, its geographical context, and its enduring impact on American society. I hope, as you watch this film, you'll be able to get a greater grasp on some of those major elements as well. Without further ado, let's begin. My first stop on the Civil War tour was, quite fittingly, the site of the first major scene of combat in the whole war, the Battle of Manassas, fought on July 21, 1861. My friend Jonathan needed a ride back to Richmond, and as we made our way down there together, we stopped at Manassas, not unlike how Union General Irwin McDowell and his troops had made a stop here on their way from Washington, D.C. to Richmond. Of course, their reasons for stopping here were far more serious. A relatively small gathering of Confederate forces had been ordered to keep the Union Army from seizing the recently selected Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Taking this city was the ultimate priority for the Union Army throughout much of the Civil War, and once they finally achieved that objective at a bloody and fiery toll in 1865, the war had officially reached its conclusion. 4 years before that great triumph for the Union, however, their forces confronted and succumbed to this early display of Confederate defenses 25 miles south of Washington, D.C. Although the Union had the numerical superiority, as would be the case throughout most contexts of the war, McDowell's forces had been hastily assembled and were mostly inexperienced. They proved to be wholly ineffective at smoldering the rebels, and the outcome of this battle, 2,700 Union dead versus 2,000 Confederate dead, guaranteed that this push to contain the wave of secession would be no mere skirmish. All of this information and much more would be conveyed to us once we made our way into Manassas National Battlefield Park right off of Sudley Road. Our knowledgeable park ranger shared plenty of fascinating insight into this 1861 battle. For instance, I learned that the Union came to call it the Battle of Manassas because they tended to label sites of combat after the cities they were featured in or near. The Confederacy, meanwhile, called it the Battle of Bull Run because they labeled the same sites based on the rivers that ran through them, which reflects how much they valued rivers for the industrial strength they granted their cause. Our guide also did a great job at recounting the significance of the Henry House. The Henry family was still occupying this house as the battle unfolded around the same hill, and bedridden Judith Carter Henry was mortally wounded as Union artillery came crashing through her bedroom. Going inside this house is one of the most moving parts of the visit to Manassas, given the window it provides into just how badly civilian life was disrupted by this 4-year conflict. And of course, it's hard to forget the towering statue of Thomas Stonewall Jackson that stands on these fields. It was during this battle, after all, that the famed Confederate general would earn his immortal nickname, given that he and his outnumbered forces withstood the Union assault like a stone wall throughout the day. After leaving the main battlefield grounds, Jonathan and I toured some of the gravestones and other landmarks strewn around the rest of the park. And that's how a very moving and engrossing first stop of the Civil War tour wrapped up. Now it was time to carry on to Richmond, where even more fascinating discovery awaited. I helped Jonathan settle in his place in Richmond, and then we grabbed dinner and caught a live jazz show together, which was an excellent way to unwind after a busy day of travel and sightseeing. The next day, I dropped Jonathan off at a bus station and then was free to make my way around town and check out the sights. As the former Confederate capital and focal point for much of the American slave trade, Richmond is ripe in powerful and unsettling history. It was my goal for the day to consume as much of it as possible, and boy was I in for a thrill. As a warm-up, I biked around town a bit and made my way to Monuments Avenue, which is dotted with statues and memorials to the likes of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and Jeb Stuart, as well as one of Arthur Ashe, a tennis legend from Richmond. These statues have always been controversial, and that only intensified after the violence in Charlottesville in 2017, which was spawned by the attempted removal of statues of this nature. I will also add that it's quite eye-opening to drive a mere 2 hours from Washington DC, where there is nothing but statues of Union generals, down to Richmond, where the exact opposite is true. That is very telling, as you can imagine. I kept on riding my bike, which allowed me to take in some of the remarkable displays of street art murals that exist all over Richmond, and made my way to the Virginia War Memorial, a shrine to the 12,000 Virginians who have fallen throughout U.S. military history. The inside exhibition, Arms for the Nation, features weapons and uniforms from various conflicts dating back to the American Revolution, as well as detailed descriptions as to how Virginia and its fighting forces were specifically impacted by each of these wars. Given the theme of the trip, I kept an especially close eye on the Civil War section of this exhibition, but it was certainly valuable to get a sense as to how the Civil War fits in with the broader narrative of Virginia's wartime past. It only took a short bike ride for me to make my way from the War Memorial to the practically adjacent American Civil War Museum, located just a short ways down the James River. Once I was there, I got to enjoy a very thorough collection of items from throughout this era, together with descriptions as to how every section of America at the time, the North, the South, and the enslaved, were affected by various events in the Civil War timeline. Insight as to how the cotton gins arrival at the turn of the century dramatically influenced the growth of slavery in America was one of the most unsettling three-way bits of insight that the collection provided to me. Right outside, my tour continued with a walkthrough of the historical site that the museum had purposely been constructed next to, the Tredegar Iron Works. Our guide, also named Josh, did a great job highlighting the significance of this factory to the war. Namely, it's largely because of Tredegar that Richmond was selected as the capital of the Confederacy. They needed a spot with the industrial capacity to fuel their war effort, and roughly half of the machinery used by the Confederacy throughout the war came straight out of Tredegar. Josh described how a variety of free, enslaved, and foreign workers worked regularly at these ironworks, shoveling coal into furnaces, he said, in much the same manner as the men we see in the boiler room in the movie Titanic. They ultimately produced over 1,000 pieces of artillery there throughout the war. Tredegar largely survived the destruction of Richmond in 1865 and remained active as an industry through the mid-20th century. Some of the machinery on the grounds had even been used as late as the Korean War. What a staggering history lesson all that turned out to be, but more was still to come. I biked uphill to the Virginia Capitol grounds, which, like Monuments Avenue, are dotted with statues of controversial figures. Not just Confederate generals, but also Harry Byrd Sr., the Virginia senator who led a massive resistance against the desegregation of the state's public schools in the 1950s. A clearly deliberate counterbalance comes in the form of the Virginia Civil Rights Memorial, installed right next to the Byrd statue in 2008. The afternoon was ticking by, but I squeezed in a visit to the White House of the Confederacy in the Court End neighborhood. Jefferson Davis and his family had made their way up here from Montgomery, Alabama, the original Confederate capital, in August 1861, and they would remain there for the rest of the war. Davis was both an important statesman and a family man, and both of these qualities are reflected in his Richmond estate, from the at-home office where he carried out his duties to the bedrooms where he stayed with his wife Verena and their 5 children, 2 of whom were born in this White House. After all of that memorable sightseeing came the most stirring part of the day and an ultra-high point of the entire trip, the Richmond Slave Trail. It was imperative for me to take in as much as I could about the practice that would destroy millions of lives and ultimately spark the war that I was committed to absorbing to the fullest on this trip. And it turned out that the brainchild of the Richmond Slave Trail Commission in 1998 would provide the ideal outlet for that very objective. I crossed the James River and began the trail at the former site of the Manchester docks. Here, slave ships would arrive to unload their captives, who then were sent across Virginia and other parts of the U.S. Around 2 million slaves were shuttled through Richmond in this manner, making the city the largest slave trading center in the Upper South during the antebellum era. Imagining giant slave ships passing by the river right in front of me proved to be quite emotionally difficult, and it only got worse as I continued on the trail and learned more of Virginia's role in this gruesome process of human trafficking. It was a relief to finally read the signs describing the rise of the abolitionist movement and the ban on the import of new slaves to America in the early 19th century, although the established system of slavery within the country would endure right up until 1865. But once I crossed the river back into downtown Richmond, I once again was plunged in the heartbreak as I came across the former sites of a slave auction house and the gallows where Gabriel Prosser was hanged in 1800. Like Malcolm X much later, Gabriel had done away with his last name, recognizing that it had been assigned to him so as to designate him as his master's property. He had led a less bloody Nat Turner-like rebellion that ultimately resulted in his execution. Not until the 21st century did U.S. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia officially pardon Gabriel for his unjust treatment. One of the few uplifting moments from this extraordinary trail was seeing the Slavery Reconciliation Statue, part of an international project done by former slaveholding nations. After consuming so much history in just a few hours, I had to hit up the Camel Bar for some live music to properly unwind. There was way too much Civil War knowledge in Richmond for me to consume in just one day. I had to stay another. I started my day at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. It's the only stop on my trip that day that wasn't strictly Civil War related, but it's such a cool museum that I couldn't resist. Plus, they had a limited run exhibition on Napoleon, with all kinds of beautiful 19th century material on loan from the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. To keep everything balanced, I did check out a couple of the BMFA's Civil War era artwork, including the 1866 John Rogers statue, baking the oath, and drawing rations. I also visited the Confederate Memorial Chapel that exists right by the museum grounds. I then returned to Tredegar and entered the visitor center that serves as the collective gateway to all of the landmarks in Richmond National Battlefield Park. All kinds of items on display tell the story of the Civil War in chronological order, while clearly communicating that the war very much remains the central event in the life of the nation. In addition, some of the 150-year-old stone foundation of the Confederate structures at Tredegar is visible at the front entrance. One of the most stirring features of this site is the remnants of the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad Bridge, which allowed for industrial material to be transported to and from the Tredegar Iron Works. The Confederate Army set fire to this bridge in April 1865 in a last-ditch attempt to save the city from the upcoming Union attack. It was quite moving to walk down the wooden boardwalk and see the charred remnants of that bridge just down the river, while illustrated panels describe the whole story of the bridge's life and destruction. My last stop in Richmond proper was at the Museum of the Confederacy, adjacent to the White House. The museum features a comprehensive chronological overview of all the major battles in which the Confederate Army took part. There was also no shortage of flags on display here either. While the quote-unquote Confederate flag that everybody thinks of is the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, used by Robert E. Lee and his troops, this museum demonstrated that there were all sorts of variants used by different sections of the Confederate society and military, as well as the national flag of the Confederacy issued in 1861. After wrapping up at that museum, I realized that, although there were many battlefield sites to see on the outskirts of Richmond, I would only have time to do one before dark. I wound up going with Malvern Hill. On my way, I made a brief stop at Glendale Cemetery, which was initially built for victims of the nearby Battle of Malvern Hill, but now features over 100 years worth of further burials. Then, onto the battlefield itself. Here in Henrico, Virginia, I felt as deep in the middle of bloody nowhere as it is possible to be. Upon closer look, though, it turns out that I was at a site of great power. In the spring of 1862, 120,000 members of the Army of Potomac, of later Gettysburg fame, were ferried down to the southeastern tip of the Virginia Peninsula and sent up to capture Richmond. If they had succeeded, the Confederates might have promptly surrendered, just as occurred when the capital city finally fell in April 1865. Only in such a scenario, the Civil War would have resulted in a relatively minor 9-month skirmish, rather than the bloodiest conflict to ever take place on American soil by a light year. Instead, Confederate forces led by various generals held their ground against the Union in what became known as the Peninsula Campaign. Finally, the most famous of all these generals, Robert E. Lee, took the offensive during the 7 Days Battle from June 25th to July 1st. The vast, empty field I had driven to was the site of the final scene of combat of the 7 Days Battle at Malvern Hill. The Union's superior artillery and coordination seriously overwhelmed the Confederate troops, led by Lee's comrade, General John Magruder. But in spite of that day's victory, Union General George McClellan proved exhausted by the withering combat of the past week, during which time the Union had taken over 15,000 casualties. He decided the Peninsula Campaign was a lost cause and whisked his remaining troops back north, thereby ending the largest operation in the Eastern Theater of the war up until that point. A bar in D.C. near the George McClellan statue on Connecticut Avenue is cleverly named McClellan's Retreat in reference to this costly withdrawal. All of this stunning history is accessible by the 1.5-mile walking trail in the park. Some of the earliest points of interest I passed were an old furnace and, as I entered the woods on my bike, the former burial sites of multiple Confederate victims of the battle, denied the honor of a proper burial that other victims were later recorded at the nearby Glendale Cemetery. Coming out of the woods, I saw rows of cannons on wheels positioned to roughly resemble the lines of both armies. This gives the viewer a rough idea of what the scale of the attack might have been on that day. That just about wrapped up my visit to the desolate but dramatic scene of July 1862's violence. Now it was back to the car and off to Pocahontas State Park, just a short ride away to camp out for the night. Good morning, Virginia! At nearly 8,000 acres, the largest state park in VA is a great gateway not only to tons of natural beauty, but also to at least 3 eras of history from 3 different centuries. It's named for Pocahontas, who lived not far from there in Lower Virginia in the early 1600s. Its 60 plus miles of trails were established by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the New Deal era, and the park is only a short ways from the Petersburg National Battlefield Park, making it of considerable interest to Civil War enthusiasts such as myself. After a great night of camping and some gorgeous bike riding around the park, I was back in the car and off to the battlefield, roughly a half-hour away. I stopped at a few excellent hidden gems along the way. The first of these was Drury's Bluff, which is one of the defenses the Confederates intelligently installed along the James River in the hopes of repelling an eventual Union assault on Richmond. That strategy was put to the test in 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign, when 5 Union warships were sent up that river, including the famous USS Monitor. These ships took heavy fire from Drury's Bluff, also known as Fort Darling, and were forced to turn around. I broke off from I-95 to learn more of this story. It was pretty cool to snake my way through the grass-covered mounds that represented former barricades, and seeing the cannon still positioned out towards the James River is totally fascinating and succeeds marvelously at making the scene of naval combat come alive in your mind. One last stop before I reached the main battlefield was Fort Harrison, which the Union later renamed Fort Burnham in honor of Brigadier General Hiram Burnham, who was killed during the initial assault on the fort on September 29, 1864. Despite the loss of Burnham, the assault was successful, and the fort was soon secured by 2,500 Union forces. Lee's attempt to reclaim the fort the following day was unsuccessful, and the Battle of Fort Harrison represents a triumph for the Union in the wildly uneven overland campaign of 1864. That same campaign was immediately followed by the 9-month siege of Petersburg from June 1864 to April 1865. After highly costly losses in the battles of Spotsylvania, the Wilderness, and Cold Harbor, General and future President Ulysses S. Grant was forced to swing down south and concentrate his army at Petersburg, where industrial resources and the railroads of Richmond provided the lifeblood of the Confederate Army. Capture Petersburg, Grant reasoned, and Richmond would soon follow. Much easier said than done, though. The Confederates rebuked the initial assault on Petersburg, and General Lee, realizing that he had to absolutely defend the city at all costs or else lose the war, installed a vast network of fortifications around the town. Grant wound up establishing trenches of his own across the way and poured tens of thousands of members of the Army of the Potomac into them. The resulting 9 months were excruciating misery for all involved, unfathomably boring for the most part, but punctuated by instances of terrifying violence, worst of all during the Battle of the Crater on July 30th. But although the Union actually suffered more casualties than the Confederates throughout this affair, the former had the luxury of being continuously replenished with food, supplies, and backup troops. The latter, meanwhile, was worn down to the point of exhaustion and starvation. That condition and the Union's numerical superiority proved to be all too much for them to bear. Lee finally abandoned his post and withdrew the Army of Northern Virginia on April 2nd, 1865. Within the next 2 weeks, Richmond would be ravaged, Lee's army would flee and be hunted down, an unconditional surrender would be issued, the Civil War would end, and Lincoln would be assassinated. A whirlwind 2-week period like none other in U.S. history. When I arrived at Petersburg, I started off at the Visitor Center, where this general narrative is conveyed quite well. Nearby were a number of cannons and a massive siege mortar called the Dictator, a 17,000-pound weapon that could hurl a 218-pound shell across 2.5 miles, all while storing 20 pounds of powder in its hull. Quite the formidable weapon, in other words. I then hopped into the car and enjoyed my driving tour of the eastern front of the battlefield. The road wound through the woods, with batteries and forts featured here and there. I especially remember the spiky recreation of the trenches from that era. They gave a clear sense of how difficult it must have been to try and penetrate these fortifications. And you can also see why Petersburg is often described as a preview of the horrors of World War I that would arrive 50 years later. After leaving the woods, I was back out in the open and at the site of one of the most famous episodes from the Siege of Petersburg, the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864. Some coal mining engineers from Pennsylvania had dug a 500-foot tunnel right up underneath the Confederate defense line. After packing the tunnel with 4 tons of dynamite and lighting the fuse, the resulting explosion devastated the rebel army. It looked as though the chance for the Union to advance after weeks of a wearying stalemate had finally arrived. Petersburg was one of the most prominent destinations for the United States colored troops throughout the war, and a division of specially trained black soldiers was prepared to lead the attack. But with the memory of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment's disastrous assault on Fort Wagner only about a year old, General George Meade of Gettysburg fame instead ordered a white division to go first, with the black soldiers following in the second wave. A safer move politically, though not strategically. The white soldiers had not been well informed of the nature of this attack and ran through the crater expecting to confront the Confederates head-on rather than run on the edges as they should have. As a result, they became hopelessly trapped at the bottom, too clustered and disorganized to turn around well. Once the rebel survivors regrouped after the explosion, the Union soldiers were at their non-existent mercy. The Battle of the Crater was a disaster for the Union. They lost 3,800 soldiers to the Confederacy's 1,500 without advancing whatsoever. Driving through Stop 8 of the Eastern Front driving tour took me right through the scene of this horrific episode. Despite the 95-degree heat, I enjoyed walking across the field where the crater had been created by the explosion. Lots of the terrain is still visibly punctured as a result. I also found myself constantly thinking of the film Cold Mountain, which opens with the events of July 30th, 1864 at this very location. Afterwards, I visited the nearby Polar Grove and Blandford cemeteries, filled with victims of the nearby siege, as well as Old Town Petersburg, where some of the old railroad junctions offer reminders as to why this site was so attractive for the Confederates to operate from and for the Union to attack. I then had about an hour's drive ahead of me before I arrived at Twin Lakes State Park. I was then able to camp out and get ready to discover what would inevitably occur after the loss of Petersburg in April 1865. The unconditional surrender of Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox only a week later. Twin Lakes Park was a beautiful place to camp out for the night and to bike around the next morning. What's more, the park ranger there suggested I make a stop at Sailor's Creek on my way to the Appomattox Courthouse. Why not, I figured. It wasn't too far out of the way. I continued the drive I'd been doing since leaving the crater yesterday, which roughly resembled the course Robert E. Lee had taken after withdrawing the Army of Northern Virginia from the trenches they'd wallowed in for months, once the triumphant Union strike at the Battle of Five Forks on April 1st, 1865, rendered the defense of Petersburg hopeless. Lee's goal was to move his forces westward and reunite with the Army of Tennessee, led by General Joseph Johnston. General Ulysses S. Grant was in hot pursuit, though, determined to make sure that would never happen. Grant's forces caught up with their rivals alongside a stream called Sailor's Creek near Farmsville, Virginia on April 6th. The Confederacy would be dealt its final blow in the ensuing battle, and over 7,000 soldiers surrendered without a fight, given how clear it was by then that the war had been lost. This is the largest taking of prisoners in any one day of the Civil War. The Visitor Center conveyed the story of this battle very thoroughly, with many weapons on display and maps detailing both sides' advancements. The nearby Hillman House made for an interesting visit as well. Much of the violence of Sailor's Creek was concentrated around this house, and it would later serve as a federal hospital, treating over 500 patients combined from both sides. There were even 150-year-old bloodstains on the floor reflecting this grisly scene. It took me another 40 minutes to drive to the Appomattox Courthouse from there. It was crazy to imagine Lee's troops covering the same distance on foot in just 3 days, given how physically and spiritually depraved they must have been at that point. But before long, I reached the spot where the Confederates famously decided that the game was over. Although the courthouse is only one of many buildings in this village, and not the one where any acts of surrender took place, the entire settlement wound up being named after its most conspicuous feature. I visited the general store, tavern, and county jail, then enjoyed a presentation by a park ranger who explained the significance of this site. Prior to the Civil War, Appomattox had been a typical farm town with about 9,000 residents, over half of whom were enslaved and living in quarters by the fields in which they worked throughout the day. Many of them never laid eyes on anywhere else in the world but here. The ranger then explained how Appomattox had become a household name. On April 9, 1865, General Lee found himself in a truly hopeless situation out in this remote region. His Army of Northern Virginia, once 90,000 strong, now numbered barely 20,000, and they were terribly undersupplied and malnourished. Meanwhile, Grant's forces were 5 times as numerous and had Lee's troops completely surrounded. The general now reached his famous conclusion. The politically neutral courthouse grounds nearby were chosen as the site of surrender. The building where it occurred was called the McLean House, named after its owner, wholesale grocer Wilmer McLean. The original house had been dismantled in 1893, but it was rebuilt in the 1940s using the original plans of the old building on exactly the same spot as it had once stood. As I approached this newer McLean house, I was immediately reminded of one of the last scenes in the movie Lincoln. In an otherwise dialogue-driven film, this wordless scene at Appomattox thrives on powerful silence. The movie set is reconstructed in astonishing accuracy to the building I was now standing in front of. Inside and to the left is the room where Lee sat down to sign the terms of unconditional surrender dictated by Grant, with Abraham Lincoln's son Robert notably in attendance. They really conjured this scene up well, even arranging the replicated furniture so that the marble table where Lee signed the paper is facing the wooden desk where Grant sat, looking on. Outside of the main park grounds was a cemetery for the Confederate victims of the Battle of Appomattox, as well as the Appomattox branch of the Museum of the Confederacy. One of the standout features of this museum was the uniform and sword that Lee wore as he made his way into McLean House to confront Grant, who let his opponent head home freely, while also making him vow to dissolve his army and recognize the federal government as legitimate. Thus concluded an extraordinary visit, for sure one of the most powerful one-day history lessons I'd ever had. Now was time to move from the site of Robert E. Lee at his lowest to that of him at his most audacious, when he led his troops in an invasion of the North, hoping to shatter his opponent's morale and see the Confederacy proudly established. Skyline Drive and George Washington National Forest made for a scenic ride, especially my stop at Crabtree Falls. Spending the night and morning in the small city of Stanton, Virginia proved to be quite pleasant as well. After leaving Stanton, my next stop was 45 minutes away at the Virginia Museum of the Civil War in New Market, where an astonishing number of arms and uniforms tell the story of the war from Virginians' perspective. Outside the main building is the site of the Battle of New Market on May 15, 1864. This proved to be an unexpected triumph for the outnumbered Southerners, who were led by Confederate Secretary of War and the former Vice President John C. Breckinridge. The cadets from the nearby Virginia Military Institute are largely credited for this surprise victory. It remains the only time in U.S. history where the active student body of a college fought as an organized unit in battle. Afterwards, my driving once again was roughly emulating the movement of Robert E. Lee's forces from 150 plus years prior. Only this time, I was going on the approximate path of the Army of Northern Virginia's 1862 invasion of the North. With this invasion, the Confederacy was finally on the offensive for the first time in the whole war. In Lee's mind, this action could relieve pressure off his battered Virginia, wreck some of the Union's industrial resources, and bring his opponents closer to the bargaining table. My driving continued to parallel the path taken by the Army of Northern Virginia as I broke off from I-81 and took a road through West Virginia towards the Antietam battlefield. Lee's army had come a similar way alongside Antietam Creek en route to Sharpsburg, Maryland, after taking several punishing hits from the Army of the Potomac alongside the South Mountain Range. Lee had no choice after that but to bring his troops to Sharpsburg, where rations and supplies were waiting for them, courtesy of Stonewall Jackson. As I pulled into Antietam National Battlefield Park, I arrived at the same spot where around 30,000 Confederate troops arrived in mid-September 1862. The problem for them was that the Army of the Potomac, led by General George McClellan, had already over twice as many men in that vicinity. No less than the bloodiest day in American history ensued when that army proceeded to strike on September 17th. Nearly 3,000 deaths and 23,000 casualties occurred. The North actually lost slightly more men, and General McClellan lost his job for not chasing down his fleeing enemy after the battle was over. Yet Antietam is remembered as a strategic victory for the Union. It ended the Confederate invasion of Maryland. It discouraged European nations like England and France from offering diplomatic and financial support to the Confederacy as Lee had once hoped for, and it set the stage for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which among much else would give the Union a boost of 180,000 soldiers from the United States colored troops, a story popularized by the movie Glory. Antietam is a truly astounding place to visit. The vast fields, dotted with statues and memorials, really create a clear sense as to what a tremendous military operation this was, and how members of all corners of the United States at the time were involved. Here are my picks for 5 of the standout features of this battlefield. Seeing this cornfield at the northern end of the park conjures haunting images of Union soldiers emerging from the stalks, almost like zombies or scarecrows in a horror film, and opening fire on their Confederate opponents. It is astonishing. Even more so are the actual statistics. 8,000 casualties were produced in 3 to 4 hours of vicious combat on the morning of September 17th, in the area around this cornfield in the east wood of Antietam, with Lee's left flank suffering the worst of the ordeal. Fighting and marching were the exception rather than the rule. Soldiers spent the vast majority of their time in camps like the ones recreated in this park. They may seem like a peaceful escape from the violence of the battlefield, yet these camps were actually the deadliest setting of the war. Of the 620,000 deaths during the Civil War, over half were caused by diseases that broke out across camps, with pneumonia, typhoid, diarrhea, and malaria being the most common. At the end of the notorious Bloody Lane is the memorial to one of the brigades worst affected by the violence in that location, the Irish Brigade, mainly comprised of Irish Americans from New York, where the Irish population was booming at that time, as we all know from the movie Gangs of New York. It was also cool to go up the nearby 60-foot observation tower, which was built in 1890 as the land was being converted into a national battlefield park, and enjoy those beautiful sweeping views. One of the last stops on the driving tour of Antietam is the bridge where 500-some Confederates engaged in what sounds like a Battle of Thermopylae-style onslaught from a vastly greater Union force, and somehow managed to hold their ground for 3 whole hours. General Ambrose Burnside finally took the bridge, however, and the Confederates had no real choice but to retreat from that moment onwards. The final and most moving stop on today's battlefield tour was the cemetery in which close to 5,000 Union Army victims of Antietam were laid to rest. The Private Soldiers Monument, a giant statue designed by Carl Conrads, stands sorrowfully over all. It's an eerie final image of a massive park so defined by death. There was really no way I could exclude Gettysburg from a trip of this nature, now was there? Especially not after I convinced my parents to come up from DC and join me. Neither one had been here since coming on middle school field trips sometime in the 1970s. I drove about an hour up from Sharpsburg, passing through the South Mountain Range, where some of the violence preceding the Battle of Antietam had occurred. Then I reunited with my parents, I chatted their ears off about my trip, and we got ready for a fun day of learning together at Gettysburg. This National Military Park is 6,000 acres in size and marks the site of the largest scale battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Over 3 million visitors come to this site each year, and my parents and I added to that total as we made our way into the visitor center. We sat down for an excellent 40-minute introductory film devised by the History Channel that establishes the consequences of Robert E. Lee's decision to invade the North for a second time in 1863. His objectives were largely the same as they had been the first time around, plus a few more. He wanted to get even with Lincoln for the Emancipation Proclamation, which infuriated him in his intention of undermining the Confederacy. In addition, Lee's forces had recomposed themselves after the shell shock of Antietam and scored some surprise victories at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. With that regained momentum, the time seemed right for another strike at the North. So it was that 70,000 members of the Army of Northern Virginia made their way across the Mason-Dixon line for the first time ever. They quickly faced some difficulties though, particularly in their inability to communicate and join forces with Major General Jeb Stuart and his troops. Needing new supplies, especially proper shoes after such a long march, the army descended on the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where they were spotted by Union Cavalry Commander John Buford, who informed his superiors of the Confederates' arrival. The Army of the Potomac once again was numerically superior to their enemies. They now numbered 100,000 strong and were re-energized by the appointment of a terrific new general, George Gordon Meade, a West Point graduate and Pennsylvania native who knew how to navigate his home state well. The Army of the Potomac had been ordered to halt Lee's advancement and drive him out of the North. Now that the two sides had crossed paths at Gettysburg, the opportunity to do so seemed to have finally arrived. Over the first 3 days of July 1863, these two armies poured tens of thousands of men into the fields of Pennsylvania, where they fired at each other all day long, paused for sleep and reinforcements, and then started all over again the following morning. By the time it was all over, the battle had yielded 50,000 casualties, including 8,000 deaths. The outcome of this battle profoundly affected the course of the Civil War. It abruptly ended Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North when he realized he could not continue after losing 28,000 of his roughly 70,000 troops in just 3 days. The Army of Northern Virginia retreated from Pennsylvania and would never be on the offensive again. Instead, they would largely be on the defensive for the remainder of the war, trying to protect vital Confederate strongholds like Richmond and Atlanta until they finally gave way. After enjoying the introductory film, my parents and I moved on to the next part of the visitor center, which features the famous 42 by 377 foot cyclorama, the Battle of Gettysburg, a depiction of the battle with emphasis on Pickett's charge by French artist Paul Philopoteau. This highly detailed painting, which took Philopoteau and 5 assistants 18 months to complete, does a tremendous job of evoking the feeling of 20,000 men engulfed in utter chaos that day. It really is a breathtaking work of art. The remainder of the visitor center features an unparalleled collection of weapons, uniforms, and equipment from this era. It succeeds in capturing the Confederates' transition from the initial feeling of encouragement to the pain and humiliation of retreat. One especially powerful element of this exhibit was the section detailing the 11 Confederate states' seceding from the Union, beginning in 1860. In case anybody ever doubts that the outbreak of the Civil War had everything to do with slavery, the declarations of secession which are available on touchscreens in this section of the exhibit, should put that to rest. The language of the secessionists could not be less ambiguous. The indoor exhibit concludes with a giant portrait of Abraham Lincoln, who added to the significance of Gettysburg 4 months after the fighting had ended with his famous speech. Right at the exit, I saw a quick show of people in 19th century costumes performing in group dances. They explained that a common way for citizens to keep the cheer during this dreary period was to engage on a regular basis in ballroom-style dances like the waltz and the polka, in much the same manner as seen in Gone with the Wind.
Lady two-hand turn. Cross and return. Three again. Honor your partners. And that was the Money Must Reel.
We spent the rest of the day largely in the car from then on. The 6,000-acre park is constructed into a 24-mile, 18-stop driving tour. On top of all the main stops on the tour, we also got out many times to see the statues and tombstones honoring the brigades and regiments of every state that took part in the Battle of Gettysburg, which is quite a lot, mind you, given that this was a scene of combat in which something like 160,000 men were employed. The tour starts at McPherson Ridge, where the earliest fighting occurred on July 1st as the Confederates reacted to the movement of Union troops and launched their initial attack at around 9 a.m. The nearby Eternal Light Peace Memorial was dedicated in 1938 and drew over 1,800 Civil War veterans who came to pay their respects 75 years after this great battle. We finished touring the northern region of the park and then made our way to the eastern section through McMillan Woods. This Seminary Ridge is where much of the Confederate Army was stationed and launched their attacks from. By extension, this part of the park is saturated with Confederate monuments, including the largest one in the whole park, which features a 41-foot statue of Robert E. Lee on horseback. It's situated where General Lee stood himself to watch the entire battle unfold on day 3. A bit later, we were at Little Round Top, the rare site in which it was the Union, not the Confederacy, which represented an outnumbered fighting force somehow holding its ground. In this case, Colonel Joshua L. Chamberlain and the 20th Maine Infantry deflected repeated assaults by their opponents, most of whom were from Alabama. Finally, they marched down the hill and forced them to surrender. And thus, Little Round Top, a key position in the Federal line, was secure. This site of Union triumph was followed by a string of stops on the tour where the Union Army had fared much worse: the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den. These were collectively the scenes of some of the most brutal violence of the entire battle, and they gravely decimated the 3rd Corps led by General Daniel Sickles. After hearing such horror stories, it was a relief to learn about a more pleasant element of this period: the music that soldiers carried with them into battle. Kudos to the orchestra at the Pennsylvania Memorial for all of these lively renditions. At the foot of East Cemetery Hill in Spangler Spring, We had a nice chat with some historical reenactors who, like the guys in Antietam, had set up a Civil War style campground and did a great job outlining the sites where soldiers spent a vast majority of their time throughout these 4 years. They also went further into explaining how baseball had emerged in these camps, with soldiers playing their own version of the British game rounders to help pass the time. This wound up being one of the major cultural legacies of the Civil War. With sunset approaching, we made our way to the high water mark, the site of perhaps the signature and climactic episode of Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge. Here, over 7,000 Union troops were able to repulse 12,000 oncoming Confederates, led into battle by Major General George Pickett. By expertly placing his men in artillery, George Meade was able not only to withstand the Confederate attack, but issue casualty rates of over 50%. Lee immediately saw that he had been met with defeat, and rode away from the battlefield muttering, "It's all my fault, it's all my fault." In contrast to the terrible violence of the day, it was quite peaceful and calm when we got to the scene of Pickett's Charge, with several cannons and a towering statue of George Meade facing the approaching sundown to a gorgeous effect. It was almost dark by the time we got to Soldiers Cemetery, the can't-miss final stop of the driving tour. It was here that Abraham Lincoln spoke on November 19, 1863, at a dedication of this cemetery to the victims of the battle 4 months prior. Lincoln wasn't actually the primary speaker of that event. That was actually Edward Everett, considered the nation's leading orator at the time, who spoke for 2 hours about the significance of the newly established Gettysburg National Cemetery and the state of the nation at that point in the war. Lincoln was then invited to give a few appropriate remarks, and in 2 minutes delivered one of the 2 most iconic speeches in American history, along with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, delivered, not coincidentally, exactly 100 years later in 1963. Thus concluded the most ambitious day of the entire trip. Now, on to the grand finale. It was only about an hour's drive through the Pennsylvania countryside to get to the state capital. Harrisburg has some strong ties to the Civil War era. It was a notable stop along the Underground Railroad for many fugitives, and it was a major industrial center for the Union, given that it was the capital of steel and coal-rich Pennsylvania. That status sent it to the top of Robert E. Lee's wish list during his 2 invasions, although he never managed to launch a proper attack on the city. The skirmish of Sporting Hill a few miles west, only days before the Battle of Gettysburg, was the closest he ever got. Luckily, this skirmish didn't amount to much, but it remains notable as the northernmost point the Army of Northern Virginia, and by extension the entire Confederacy, ever reached during the war. When I arrived to town, I cycled around the Capitol grounds, which featured plenty of nice flora and architecture. I then made my way up State Street, enjoyed the lovely views of Reservoir Park, and then began my tour of the National Civil War Museum. Founded in 2001 and now cooperated by the Smithsonian Institution, this 8,000 square foot museum with 24,000 items on display would be an attractive visit for history enthusiasts on any occasion. But as the final stop of my Civil War tour, it was especially valuable as a means of tying together everything I had learned about the Civil War over the previous week and placing all the events I'd encountered during my travels on the grand timeline of the entire massive and brutal conflict. The museum's first exhibit was called A House Divided 1850 to 1860, and it detailed some of the major conflicts at the core of antebellum America. By far the most heartbreaking part of this exhibit were the wax sculptures portraying a slave owner tearing apart a mother and her daughter at a slave auction. Right after that was another powerful wax sculpture exhibit, one which portrayed the Confederates at Fort Sumter, the bloodless siege that represented the opening conflict of the Civil War. Rooms like these across the museum helped me to fill in the gaps created by the many important sites I had been unable to visit during my past week of travel. Inside the medicine room, the wax sculptures of nurses amputating their patients' legs were pretty gruesome, but they did help bring this very important element of the Civil War to life, and also enforced one of the key ways in which women contributed to the war effort. All throughout the museum, there were vast collections of rifles, bayonets, and other forms of weaponry from the 1860s. I especially enjoyed seeing the section on Civil War music. This period solidified the usage of bugles and other brass instruments throughout the United States military, and lots of the instruments that soldiers discarded on the battlefield were later collected by civilians, thus setting the stage for the earliest rudimentary forms of blues and jazz music. It was nice getting a recap of my most recent visits to sites like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox. One of the last rooms in the museum was full of various portraits from the era, many of which were taken by Alexander Gardner, the author of the most famous presidential portrait of Abraham Lincoln. This room achieved the dual effect of showing how people of all backgrounds were affected by the fighting, as well as how daguerreotype style portrait making really took flight during this era. Visit the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. for more information. After leaving the museum, I enjoyed the rich variety of public artwork that exists across Harrisburg, as well as the numerous gems that are located alongside the Susquehanna River. These include the stadium for one of the Nationals minor league teams, the Harrisburg Senators, and the World War I Buddy Monument, the kind of statue you see just about everywhere in certain parts of Western Europe. Well, I sure had a nice little trip to Harrisburg. After that, it was time for a 2-hour drive through the fields of Pennsylvania and back home. One Civil War tour in the books.